treatable. Really, it's treatable. Yes, it's treatable. It's the Treatable Podcast. Say what's on your mind. It's the Treatable Podcast. Real, coming, treatable. It's the Treatable Podcast. It's all on the Treatable Podcast.
When you really think about it, therapy is kind of weird. You're paying a stranger to listen to you talk about your problems. And maybe that just doesn't sound appealing to you. Maybe you don't want to spill the tea on your own life, but you still want to get some outside help. If that sounds like you, you're in luck. There are many different therapeutic modalities that go beyond talking to a professional stranger. And today, we're going to explore 3 of them. Welcome to Treatable, the podcast where we unpack mental health topics with experts who show us that change is possible. Today, we're exploring 3 different therapeutic modalities that go beyond traditional talk therapy. And joining us for this discussion is Samantha Crean. Samantha is a licensed therapist and a certified therapeutic recreation specialist who specializes in helping teens overcome life's challenges. She's an advocate of trauma-informed care, and she uses a unique blend of active engagement, creativity, and evidence-based therapies like ART, EXRP, and DBT to help her clients. And if you're like, yo, what are those letters? No worries, we're going to unpack all of them in the conversation today.
Treatable Podcast. It's all on the Treatable Podcast.
Samantha, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So let's start with ART, not to be confused with art therapy. What is it? Who it helps? That sort of thing.
So essentially, ART stands for Accelerated Resolution Therapy. It's definitely a little bit of a newer therapy that utilizes eye movements. It uses eye movements to help reprocess memories, like stressors, things that are going on, and helps regulate our bodies. It's a little bit different in that it's meant to be a really quick and short-term therapy. So people see results within 1 to 5 sessions, which is really cool. So ART can really help with folks that have significant traumas, depressive symptoms, anxieties, phobias. And I think the appeal to it is you actually don't really have to come in and talk about something that is distressing for you. So a lot of times people who have been through significant traumas don't want to talk about those traumas. So they can come in and do the short-term therapy, which utilizes guided imagery. So kind of thinking about something that has happened or a distressful situation, and it utilizes eye movements to help reprocess that memory. I've mainly been working with it for trauma. I've been able to see significant results with trauma-based symptoms.
So question, you said a few keywords that stuck out to me. It reminded me of another trauma-informed therapy, EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, where you're tracking either a light back and forth or sometimes someone's finger, or there's buzzers that are going back and forth. How is this different from EMDR?
When I usually am talking about ART, I will often say it's similar to EMDR, but there are some key differences. So with ART, we are really mainly going back and forth between visualizing the situation and our body sensations. So we go back and forth between both of those using, again, the bilateral stimulation. So whether it's eye movements, following a light bar, or even using like tappers is something that we often use. It really helps with taking that body sensation that we might be feeling about from a painful experience, and we're working on processing that out of our bodies. EMDR is usually a little bit more long-term for folks than ART. ART is meant usually, like I said, 1 to 5 sessions.
Okay, got it. And is there anything that people need to know about ART that maybe they get wrong, or who is this ideal for? It's ideal for people with depression, anxiety, trauma, but it's mostly like a trauma-informed therapy type of thing.
The cool thing about it is like you can really tailor an ART session for anyone, even just like a life stressor, or if there's something going on at work that you're like, I kind of just want to process this out. ART can really be helpful for that. I've mainly seen it for trauma, but folks that maybe have tried other therapies. For instance, if you have OCD and you maybe have tried EXRP, the exposure-based therapy, which I know we'll get into in a moment, but maybe they have found that it hasn't been as helpful. ART is like a great, like, let's try this instead and see if this kind of can help us feel like unstuck.
Yeah. And so the challenge, so cognitive behavioral therapy is one of the most researched types of therapies. People tend to talk about cognitive behavioral therapy all the time. In a part of CBT is exposure therapy. And so, especially, 10, 20 years ago, a key thing that people were thinking about when it came to traumas is, oh, if you have a phobia, if you have a trauma, just re expose yourself to that until you're desensitized to that. But the problem with that is one, you become re traumatized in the process of this. And two, it takes a significant amount of exposure in order to become desensitized. And even if you do become desensitized to a particular body sensation, sometimes that's not even a good thing, right? Because one of our body's key mechanisms is to dissociate or to compartmentalize when something is overwhelming and it's not something we can process. So this is like a way for you to be able to go back and forth to tap into maybe some of the feelings in your body of a particular experience without having to re-traumatize somebody. But how does somebody do that without tapping into the story of their trauma?
They really are tapping into their story by like playing it out and visualizing it in their mind. I think the difference is when they're doing it, they're pairing it with the eye movements. And so whenever we're doing bilateral stimulation, it's actually activating our parasympathetic nervous system, our calm response.
For folks who aren't familiar, the parasympathetic nervous system is a network of nerves that helps the body relax. When activated, the parasympathetic nervous system slows the heart rate and breathing, it lowers your blood pressure, it increases digestion. It's responsible for our body's rest and digest response, or as Samantha says, our calm response.
And so even though they're not talking about it out loud, they're closing their eyes or they're focusing on that eye movements, reliving it at the same time, the eye movements or that bilateral stimulation is sending that signal to our body, that calm response, right? To help us feel a little bit more regulated when managing it. And I think the cool thing about ART is after you go through, visualizing and the guided imagery of, X event, you're then going back into it and getting to change little parts of it and not necessarily changing the facts about what happened, but you get to bring different images and supports into the event. You almost get to reprocess it in a different way so that you don't have the same physiological response to X events or X triggers.
Can you give some examples of the questions that you might ask at the beginning to help someone visualize, and then maybe some examples of how you might help somebody create a new visual for an experience that they've had in the past?
So examples that I might say for when they're rethinking about it would be, is there anyone that you would like with you? Maybe somebody that's giving you a hug, maybe a support person or a support animal. Can you go into this event or image and give yourself a shield to protect yourself from said event? Maybe the person has been in a situation with somebody and maybe we can't take that person out of the event, but can we shrink them? Can we reduce their power? Can we make them smaller? Can we give you a microphone so that way you can give yourself a voice and be heard and seen in that moment? So those are some examples I might give and some tools that I might offer somebody. And then I'm sorry, can you repeat the first part of your question?
Yeah, the first part was, what when you're first helping them visualize the situation, what are some of the questions that you might ask?
Yeah. So I actually can work with somebody and not really know details about their event. One of the first key questions that I'm asking them is like, how would this help you? What are the goals that you want to get out of this? Is it to, reduce your nightmares? Is it to be able to go to your job every day and feel safe and comfortable? But folks that I have worked with they can disclose to me what they want to process, but they also don't need to, which is kind of, I think, some of the appeal about it of like, I want to get support with this, but I don't want to give you all the information or share. And so I usually just ask, is this a prior event? So is this something that has happened earlier in your life, or is this something that is ongoing, like an anxiety or a phobia or a struggle? ART is based in script. So it helps me decide what script I'm going to be using and implementing in that session.
I'm curious, could you explain what the different kinds of scripts are? Can you give some examples of how you might use them with different clients?
Yeah. So there's a script for somebody that's coming in. It's like, I am really struggling at my job. I have this work situation that's ongoing. I want support with that. So I would then do a script called a typical day script, where they're going in and visualizing all the distressing parts of what a typical day looks like for them with this stressor or event, versus something that maybe has been like an isolated past event. Let's say, for instance, like a car accident. I'm going to use a different script that's just going back at that one event. So not looking at like a whole day or an ongoing thing, but just that isolated event.
This episode of Treatable is brought to you by Sandstone Care, which helps teens, young adults, and their families overcome challenges with mental health, substance use, and addiction. They provide age-specific, individualized treatment plans centered around your unique situation and goals, and they only use evidence-based therapies to help you get there. They keep their group therapy sizes small so folks can connect with others going through the same struggle and so that you never feel alone. They also give academic and vocational support to help you improve your grades or to get started on your career path. And lastly, because they know that mental health and substance use affect the people closest to us, they provide support for the whole family through their family therapy program. To learn more about teen and young adult treatment options, go to sandstonecare.com. Change is possible, and Sandstone Care is here to help. So, a few things that stick out to me when I'm trying to understand this is one, is that it's really challenging to be able to go into any traumatic thought or memory if you don't already have a way to be able to calm your body down and to be able to reset yourself and to reorient yourself back in your body. So the cool thing about therapies like ART or EMDR is that there's a tactile or a physical way for you to be able to make sure that you are still in your body and not on the verge of being re-traumatized. So we know that our trauma is stored in the right side of our brain, along with our physical symptoms. So doing something that helps orient us back into our physicality is helpful in being able to process that. It's like being able to think of your trauma as like really deep water. And in order for you to go into that deep water, you kind of need an air supply back to the real world where you can get oxygen. And so this way of going back and forth and doing eye movements can be a really helpful way to do that. And the second thing that you talked about that was really interesting was the use of visualization in a way to reorient the story and to help change the narrative to a more empowering narrative, whether that's, having a support person or an animal or a shield or reducing a person's power or giving this person a microphone. And the thing that stood out to me is that oftentimes if we're in a trauma, fight or flight or a freeze state, creative thinking is something that you cannot do. You cannot be creative when you are thinking about running for your life, right? And so if you're able to do that kind of thing in a therapy session while talking about a traumatic event in your life, you're telling your body that, hey, we're actually able to process this now because we're able to think about it from a different point of view. Is that right?
Absolutely.
Awesome. Okay, so we have two other therapies that we wanted to get into today, EXRP and DBT. Can you unpack EXRP for us? What is it? What does it stand for? And how does it help?
So it's exposure response prevention. And essentially, EXRP is meant for folks with anxiety, OCD, social anxiety, phobias. And as you mentioned earlier, it's this idea of exposing yourself and trying to desensitize. So, for instance, if somebody has a phobia, to let's say elevators, right? Then we're going to be creating a hierarchy. So, a hierarchy is essentially creating like a list from what is the most significant anxiety you might feel, which might be like actually going on an elevator and going up 10 floors, to the lowest might be even thinking about like walking past an elevator. So we're creating a hierarchy and then we're working our way up. So when I'm working with folks on doing exposures, like I often say, I'm not going to throw you in the deep end before you can swim, right? Like we're not going next week to take an elevator all the way to the 100th floor. Like we're going to start small and we're going to gradually expose yourself to this fear. So we might, in a session, just look at different pictures of elevators, or we might watch some videos of people going on elevators. We might watch like the Tower of Terror, like in Disney World, that elevator drop, or, we're doing creative things to visualize that. We might then have the client think about going on an elevator, and then we might work our way to going to see an elevator, to look at it, to watch people going on and off an elevator, and to hopefully gradually being able to do that thing that we're most afraid of. And the idea, again, is desensitizing to this fear and being able to, again, a lot of times it's people want to do these things because it's keeping their life really small. So they want to be able to do these things to help them feel less anxious, feel like they can have more control in their lives. So that's really what EXRP is, as well as like the prevention side too. So for somebody with OCD that might have compulsions, how can we work on exposing ourselves to the things that, again, make us feel uncomfortable and maybe not engaging in that compulsion? So how can we, almost like urge surfing, like how can we ride out that wave, that discomfort that we might feel in our body without having to tap something or whatever the compulsion might be. Even sometimes compulsions can even be in our minds. Like we can have mental compulsions, whether they're undoing a thought, right? Like if I have a bad thought, I need to maybe replace it with a good thought, or I need to just do this thing because it'll just feel right. So some of these things are a little bit more tricky to figure out, but we can work on like being able to, again, ride out that discomfort of that emotion, that anxiety that we're feeling, and not engaging in compulsion.
Interesting. So it's a difference in exposure therapy in that there's a hierarchy. There's almost like a scaffolded approach in which you're saying, okay, if the scariest thing is riding in the elevator for 10 floors, then we need to be able to create a different series of things that allow you to gradually increase your resilience. My question is, I've seen a pattern when it comes to these kinds of things, in that usually something even as seemingly unconnected as like an elevator is connected to some sort of underlying thing, right? Maybe a trauma, maybe an experience that they had that they don't even remember. Is it worth addressing the manifestation of a fear before going to its source? Or can you go and enter in any specific way? Are they always connected?
I don't know if I have like the perfect answer for this, because do feel like it depends on the person and meeting the client where they're at, right? A lot of times, like we call them core beliefs or core fears. If we're using the elevator example, for instance, maybe there's a core fear of just like being alone or feeling like trapped. I don't, but like there could be this like real core fear and belief. And if that's the case, then like that is something that we want to target. And so maybe we do target it by doing the elevator exposures. And then once we kind of get to that point where, okay, the person is riding the elevators, now how else can we tap in and work on challenging that core fear? So if it maybe the client doesn't even realize how it's showing up in their life of this core fear. And so maybe that kind of, by doing the exposures, it opens up this idea of like, how else is this impacting you and how else can we work on addressing it? So I think there's definitely different ways to go about it. I think a lot of it is just joining the client, because maybe the client's just really motivated to work on the elevators right now, and that's what we work on. But then in time, we can work on like, really getting to that core fear.
So you're starting with the client's goals, and because You need to work off of their motivation. And if this is the first thing, even if you understand that there's like an underlying issue or you suspect that there's some underlying issue, it's best to meet the client where they're at, to think about their goals, to help them get that goal. And that forms a relationship of safety and trust that will probably allow you to enter into other things. I could imagine myself if I was scared of elevators being like, okay, now I've fixed my elevator thing. I'm done with therapy. I don't need this anymore. We'll do one more session that's like a victory lap session, and you can just call me back and tell me how brave I was and how everything in life's going to be great. And then I imagine Samantha saying, let's talk about core beliefs. Let's talk about core fears. And maybe this is connected with something else. And as a way to be able to help transition that, which may be comforting or may be challenging, probably challenging if it's you. Okay. So in our toolkit, we've got two things so far. We've got accelerated resolution therapy. We've got exposure response prevention, EXRP. And then we've got one more to talk through, and that is DBT, or dialectical behavioral therapy. Tell us, when would you use this in your toolkit? Who is this especially for?
So, this DBT is essentially for folks who are really struggling with emotion regulation, experiencing life threatening behaviors. So, suicidal thoughts, actions, self harm behaviors. So, cutting, burning, any sort of like bodily harm. It also can be really helpful for folks with eating disorders and substance abuse. So, any sort of like risky behaviors, again, emotion dysregulation, even really like a lot of times people come in and they're having issues or difficulties in their relationships. DBT really kind of has that skill based foundation to help with a lot of those things. So, when I'm working with folks that are coming in with DBT, I'm orienting them to what this looks like. We often do like a 6-month commitment where they're going to be meeting with me one on one, connecting them with skills group to really offer them that like comprehensive DBT, as well as phone coaching too, which is support outside of session, to help them with applying skills in real time when they're needing it, when they're having urges to self-harm, when they're having urges to use substances. It's a really kind of great additional support. So those are when those clients are coming to me, that's when I'm recommending DBT. I think DBT really helps with managing those life-threatening behaviors before we can maybe get to some other work. So DBT is in different stages. So stage 1 is kind of really gaining like behavioral control. So how can I work on reducing suicidal actions or urges or self-harm urges and feeling a little bit more stabilized in life? And then once those things really come down, we can work on addressing other targets. So maybe there's some underlying OCD or anxiety that then we can go into some other work.
So you said the first part was the behavioral control or reducing these self-harming behaviors. What are the second two?
There's 4 stages actually in DBT. So it's getting behavioral control for stage 1. Stage 2 is all about like emotional experiencing. So for those that may be suppressing emotions with substances or other risky behaviors, once those behaviors are stabilized, we can then work on emotional experiencing. Stage 2 is all about the quality of life. So like now that like things are feeling good, how can we work on those stressors? So how can I work on repairing relationships or building my day? Like if my life has been nothing but all substance use, how can I fill my day with meaningful things? How can I get reconnected with my life and rebuild that? And stage 4 is all like maintenance. Okay, like how can I keep this going?
Yeah, so we got four different parts. We've got behavioral control, emotional experiencing, third is quality of life, and four is maintenance. And when we think about this, one of the unique things about DBT is it's super practical, but there's also, as you mentioned, that social component, meaning that you're in a group. Why is the group work important when it comes to DBT?
I think for a lot of different reasons, but mainly they're learning skills. So it's really like a psychoeducational experience where they're coming in, they're connecting with peers and learning and building skills together. I think group can be helpful to learn like I'm not alone, like I'm not the only person going through this. and being able to have a separate environment to learn those skills. Then as an individual DBT therapist, I can then just pull from that and help a client apply those skills. Like, you learn this skill. I don't have to spend time like reviewing it, teaching it, which kind of then takes away from our session. We can work on like, what are the barriers of applying this skill? Like, what's getting in the way of you practicing this skill? And it just really enhances the work that I'm doing when they can get that outside support and in group. And having that, I think, combined also is like the perfect like recipe for success. So being able to have both components happening at the same time, I think just helps people get to their goals quicker, right?
Wow, there's so much I want to talk about with this, but I think the first thing that comes to my mind is one, I wish DBT was just a class in school that all students had to take. As a former teacher, I remember we would have a session that was like around social emotional learning. And while we would talk about concepts like empathy, like forgiveness, like all of these different almost theoretical things, I think that there's a huge need, to your point, to practice the actual skills that you're going to be using in real life. Because, and tell me if I'm right in this, because this is just the pattern that I'm recognizing here. You only learn positive coping mechanisms from other people. Like, I think you can learn a lot of really bad coping skills, right, from a lot of different sources. We come up with all different ways to be able to survive challenging environments and do whatever it takes to be able to make it through the day. But when it comes to positive skills to be able to regulate our emotions or to process things, we only learn that through other humans.
Yeah, I'm even thinking of like even how we from an early age, how things are modeled to us from like our parents. Young kids are experiencing really intense emotions. They don't know what to do with them. So being able to model, show, and teach different ways to cope, I think is really huge. And yeah, I don't think it really just comes naturally to be able to just cope with a really big emotion. They are things that are taught.
Yeah, we do have the ability to connect. We come into this world and we have mirror neurons and we're looking at our caregivers and we want to sync our heartbeats with them and our breaths with them. And when we're crying and they pick us up, we naturally look at their face to be able to make sure things are okay. And then as the years progress and the complexity of the things that make us mad, not just, being hungry or needing a change, but as we have other types of challenges that we experience, the ability of our caretaker to model how to self-soothe, how to regulate your emotions is going to be the ceiling and the limit for which you are able to process your problems. And I don't think a ton of people think about that in the context of every day. I don't think that many humans are thinking, well, if I don't teach this self-soothing pattern to my child or to this student I have, then they're never going to learn it. Because by the way, humans are the only ones who can teach a self-soothing pattern. Like, it's something we have to learn from each other. I don't think that that's a thing. I think that we believe, at least in the United States, that there's a lot of internal things that you have to be able to tap into to be able, just calm down, just, regulate yourself, relax. It's not that serious. That's not stuff that we actually have within us naturally.
No, and those are really great examples. I hear that a lot from the teens I work with, where parents or other people are just saying like, "Oh, calm down," or "chill out," and it actually can be really invalidating. It doesn't feel good when someone just says calm down or it's not a big deal, when actually it really internally feels so big. And so like those little statements over time can create that like disconnect.
So the other thing that this makes me think about when it comes to how folks are relating to one another, I was having dinner with a friend on Saturday and he was talking about the current political climate and how he was super stressed out about it. And he was spiraling. He was saying, like, and it makes me think of this and it makes me think of that. And then I'm worried about this. And then what's going to happen here? And at the end of it, he paused and he looked at everyone at the table and he said, "Hey, I'm really sorry for bringing this up. I know it's a downer." And my knee jerk reaction was like, "Hey, man, if you feel some sort of anxiety about it, you have to talk about it." because that's like a human thing. And who else are you going to be able to talk about it except with your friends? Where is that energy going to go if you don't have a positive way to be able to communicate it to the world? And he's a grown ass man. So there's that whole thing that's not something that is consistently told to us. Yeah, express your feelings because you need to like let this stuff out, or hey, we can work through these feelings in a positive way. It's okay. And everything doesn't have to be positive when you're hanging out with friends. It's like a part of friendship, a part of relationships. And at least as a teacher, there's so many things I wish I could go back and do. But that whole DBT skills thing of self regulation, of being able to calm yourself, I wish that there's just a whole class in that where we taught that every day for an hour every day, just like math or social studies or whatever.
Even though I know DBT is like specialized for folks with emotion dysregulation, like I think DBT skills can be helpful for every human. There's so much mindfulness components in DBT, distress tolerance. Like, what do I do when things really go off the wall and I'm in a crisis situation? Like, how can I manage that? Emotion regulation skills, when I feel X emotion, how can I work through it? What are some things I can do to take care of myself? And then the last one is like the relationship skills. How can I work on being assertive, right? Or, for especially for folks that are chronic people pleasers, how can I work on saying no, setting a boundary, maintaining relationships, healthy relationships? So yeah, I wish it could be taught in every school.
So you primarily work with a lot of teens, you work with a lot of younger folks, and I'm guessing that you have a whole series of things in your toolkit. One of the things is therapeutic recreation specialist. So can you kind of unpack when it comes to that combination of therapy and recreation? Why is that an important thing to think about when you're trying to work with teens and support people?
So yeah, that's actually my background. So when I was in undergrad, I went to school for recreation therapy. And that was my first into the mental health world and kind of what landed me into being a mental health therapist. I am what's called like a CTRS. And I really love that I get to bring in this side of me because it's like my creative side. So using different modalities, movement, art, music, bringing in that leisure or recreation component. I'll never forget one of my first clients like really didn't want to be in therapy. And so my in with this client was using their interests of music. And so to kind of build that rapport and trust, like we would sometimes just like listen to songs. And that was like my in to try and connect with her and then get into DBT because otherwise it was like she was really guarded and it was hard for her to open up. So using somebody's preferred leisure interests is I think sometimes that like first stepping stone in connecting with clients. And I think too, I love it because when folks are really, really like chronically depressed and they are struggling with getting out of bed, filling their day, having meaningful things, being able to help them build their leisure repertoire of like, what are some things that you can connect with? And so helping them really build a life that they love, I think is really huge. I think too, it's just a nice balance of being able to use creative interventions and then like the therapies of like the DBT exposure, all that kind of stuff.
It kind of is in the same theme of scaffolding of in teaching, we called it scaffolding instruction, but with your exposure response prevention, it's kind of that same thing. But you have to start somewhere. You have to start usually around a client's goals. And usually you also have to start in a place of safety. Therapy cannot progress. We cannot grow emotionally unless we first feel safe. I talk about it on this podcast all the time. It's one of the foundations of Maslow's hierarchy, just like food and sleep and water and shelter and clothing. You actually have to feel safe. And leisure activity is stuff that you only do when you feel safe, right? It's like in order to enjoy something, you actually have to feel safe. And meeting somebody where they're at, whether it's music or any other thing, is first just about establishing a relationship of safety. And oftentimes that connection is not there. So, with that in mind, I have a follow up question for you. When it came to the music you were listening to with a client, what kind of music was it and how did it lead into deeper therapy work?
So this client loved Kid Cudi. So we would listen to Kid Cudi songs, and that was our way to just like talk about what the songs meant to her. I'd print off lyrics to it, and she would circle words or highlight things that really resonated with her. And that was kind of like our start of like how we can start to talk about these things. But it was all about how the music made her feel, doing some journaling around that, just noticing like what she felt in her body when we would listen to the song together. So we would do different like exercises, but that was how we would start our session, by picking a song and listening to it together and then going from there and letting it unfold.
I think a big part of this podcast is helping people understand that therapy is not just about talking about your problems to somebody, that therapy looks really different and it's as diverse as our problems and our minds and our context and our experience. And so that there's a lot of different ways to be able to connect with folks. And I hope that people listening or watching this would say, hey, okay, maybe there's actually a spot for me. And a unique thing with therapy, sometimes you're not even sure if you actually want the problem solved. I knew one therapist and he told me, he said, as a therapist, do you realize how committed some people are to their own misery? Which is a terribly sad and challenging thing. But anybody who's especially worked with teens can understand is that you're working with people who may or may not be down for this whole thing, whatever it is you're doing, whether it's teaching them math problems or talking about their feelings or coping strategies. That's like a really hard thing to be able to overcome. So this recreational therapy seems like a great way to be able to connect with somebody on a human level and to put down those barriers of saying, hey, this is about, me trying to extract or impart some bad thinking from your brain and give you good thinking. It's actually saying, hey, let me just connect with you.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. And so we've talked about the differences. Just to summarize, ART, accelerated resolution therapy, this is all about using eye movements, visualization, and a short amount of sessions to help be able to treat usually a traumatic episode in a way that the client doesn't have to reveal a whole bunch of stuff about them. They're able to use their creative side of their brain to be able to manipulate or to change the narrative to a more empowering thing. We have exposure response prevention, which can be helpful for things like anxiety and OCD or social phobias, which has a gradual hierarchy of fears and building up or scaffolding those exposures to those things to where eventually it's not a big deal. And once you've done that thing, you can maybe go to the underlying thing behind that phobia. And then lastly, DBT, dialectical behavioral therapy, has 4 different components. The first is behavior control. The second is emotional regulation or emotional experiences. The third is quality of life. And the fourth is maintenance. Some unique things about this is it's very practical skills. Often these skills are learned in a group environment. So there's a social component. And then there's also this component where you have this one-on-one relationship with the therapist that you can call or text in distressing time. And it's mainly to be able to help eliminate self-harming behavior. So things like substance use or cutting or other things that might be challenging. Is there anything I'm missing out on when it comes to summarizing these therapies? Anything you want people to know?
Yeah, I think the last thing that I will say too, and I meant to go over this when we were talking about DBT, of like, what's the difference between DBT and comprehensive DBT, right? In order for it to be comprehensive, like a person does need to be in individual therapy with a DBT therapist in skills group, have access to phone coaching. And then that last component was that there's a consultation group for the DBT therapist. So in our group practice, we meet bi-weekly and we go over our cases, because working with high risk clients, like it can be hard at times, and being able to like have the brain power of a consultation group is really, really helpful in identifying what are the treatment interfering behaviors, what's getting in the way from either the client or the therapist, and how can I better like conceptualize this client? What are things I need to like work to really make sure that I'm being adherent in DBT?
That must be such a comforting thing for a client who's in DBT, if you think about it, because do you really want to entrust all of your mental health treatment to the brain of one person? Chances are they're not going to be able to catch everything. So when a therapist is able to sit down with a bunch of other therapists and kind of workshop this and talk about, hey, here's the challenges. What are we thinking here? You now have so many people who are able to give really valuable insight. And when you have the diversity of perspectives and opinions, things are less likely to fall through the cracks. And you're able to ensure that each client is getting the best care that they need. So I love that. I mean, if it's me, I want to have as many opinions on this as possible, because the more opinions are going to make this a better thing, especially when it comes to something as serious as my mental health.
That's exactly how I kind of phrase it and pitch it to my clients, is like, for the price of one therapist, you're getting like 10 other therapist brains to support you. It's really, really cool and empowering too for us as therapists to like keep going with this work.
Amazing. Can you tell me where people can go to learn more about you and the awesome work that you're doing?
You can visit our website, which is creativehealingphilly.com. And our bios are all on our website. So you can find information about me and the other therapists on our team.
All right, y'all. If you're struggling with anxiety, if you're struggling with trauma, if you're struggling with self-harm, we've outlined 3 really cool therapies. Just as a quick introduction, we'll probably do some deeper dive on these because I'm sure each of these could warrant their own episode. But all of these things, these problems that you experience, they're real, but they're also much more common than you think. And with the help of these types of therapies, ART, exposure response prevention, and DBT, they're also preventable and treatable. We will see you on the next episode. This episode of Treatable was edited by Daniel Lopez. The intro and explanatory sections of the episode were written by Alexandra Kruger. The theme song was created by Sebastian Gonzalez, and the cover art for this episode is created by Joel Daniel. If you got any value from this episode, it would personally mean the world to me if you would leave us a 5-star review wherever you get your podcasts. It helps to spread mental health awareness to more folks, and I read each and every comment that people leave. So tell us what you appreciate about the podcast, and you just might hear us feature it on the next episode. All of my love, and we'll see you on the next one.